The letter. When my mother died, I thought I was prepared. She had been sick for a long time. Cancer is cruel that way. It gives you time to say goodbye, but makes the goodbye feel longer than it should be. Still, when I held her cold hand one last time, something inside me cracked. Grief doesn't arrive like a storm. It seeps in quietly, like water under a door, and before you realize it, your whole world is flooded. After the funeral, I returned to my small apartment in the city and tried to resume normal life. But nothing felt normal. A week after the funeral, I received a letter in the mail.
No stamp.
No return address. Just my name, Eleanor Whitmore, written in a looping, careful hand. The envelope was thick and yellowed with age. Inside was a single sheet of paper that smelled faintly of lavender and old books. Come to the house on Sycamore Hill. There are things you need to know. A friend. That was all. The house on Sycamore Hill. I hadn't been there since I was 13. It had belonged to my grandmother, Margaret Whitmore, a woman who lived more in whispers than in memories. She vanished without a trace when I was a child. No note, no warning, just gone. My mother always avoided the topic. When I asked, she'd change the subject or say, "Your grandmother had demons, Ellie. Leave it be." But I never could. The memories were fragmented. My grandmother's laugh, deep and sudden like thunder. The creaking wood floors of the old house. The scent of pipe tobacco and lemon soap. The old record player humming classical music on Sunday afternoons. Then one night, she was gone. The police had searched. No signs of forced entry.
No packed bags.
Just her favorite shawl left hanging by the door, as if she intended to return. But she never did. And now, decades later, a letter. I held the paper in my hands for a long time, the silence around me loud and pressing. Was this a cruel prank? A mistake? Who would know to send this now, right after my mother's death? There was only one way to find out. 2 days later, I was in my car, driving north along winding roads lined with dead leaves and rust-colored trees. The air turned colder with every mile. The farther I drove, the quieter the world became. As I neared Sycamore Hill, memories returned in waves. My mother singing softly in the car. My small hands gripping a stuffed rabbit. My grandmother waiting at the gate with arms wide open. I pulled into the long, gravel driveway and killed the engine. The house stood at the top of the hill, just as I remembered it. Tall and gray, with crooked shutters and a wraparound porch covered in vines. It looked abandoned, but not unloved. The windows were dusty, but not broken. The roof sagged, but it still stood. I half expected the door to be locked, but when I turned the handle, it opened with a groan, as if the house had been holding its breath for years and was finally exhaling. The smell hit me first. Old wood, damp fabric, and something else. Something familiar. Lavender. I stepped inside. The air was heavy with silence. Dust motes floated in the light from the stained glass window above the staircase. The wallpaper peeled in corners. An old clock ticked faintly somewhere deeper in the house. I should have been afraid, but instead I felt welcome. As I walked through the hallway, every creak beneath my feet felt like a memory whispering hello. On the mantel above the fireplace were photographs, black and white, sepia, and faded color. My mother as a child. A man in uniform I didn't recognize. And in the center, my grandmother. Her eyes met mine across time, calm, knowing, sad. In the dining room, the long table was covered with a white cloth, yellowed at the edges. A teacup still rested in its saucer. Had she been here recently? No, it was too still, too untouched. Then I saw it. An envelope, resting neatly at the center of the table. My name again. The same handwriting. I opened it with trembling fingers. Eleanor, if you are reading this, then you've come. Good. This house holds secrets. Secrets your mother never knew. Secrets I never wanted her to carry. But you were always meant to find them. Go to the attic. Look in the old cedar trunk. The truth is waiting. M. I stared at the words. Margaret. My grandmother. Alive? Or had she written this long ago? I folded the letter and looked around, as if the walls themselves might answer. 100 questions swirled in my head, but one pulled ahead of the rest. What truth had she hidden? And why was I the one meant to find it? Part 2, Ghosts of the Past. The attic door was where I remembered it, at the end of the second-floor hallway, just past the narrow window that overlooked the orchard. The pull-string light bulb still hung above, swaying gently though there was no wind. I hesitated with my hand on the wooden ladder. The air around it felt different, colder, heavier. I climbed slowly, each step groaning louder than the last, as if the house itself didn't want me to go up. The attic was dim, lit only by a single bulb and the dusty beams of sunlight filtering through the slats in the roof. The room smelled of mothballs, cedar, and something older. Memories, perhaps. Piled boxes, broken furniture, and sheets covering old shapes surrounded me like forgotten sentinels. In the far corner, beneath a quilt that looked hand-stitched, sat the cedar trunk. My fingers trembled as I pulled back the fabric. The trunk was carved with vines and leaves, its brass latch tarnished with time. I knelt down and slowly lifted the lid. Inside, carefully arranged, were dozens of envelopes. Some were brittle with age, others still crisp. Each one was addressed in the same looping script. To Helen Whitmore, my mother. Every single letter, dozens, maybe more, had been written by Margaret. None had been opened. Each envelope was dated, some as far back as 1986, others as recent as 2003. They spanned decades. I took one and carefully opened it, unfolding the fragile paper. My dearest Helen, I don't know if this will ever reach you. I have sent so many. I've tried to call, to write, but I believe someone is keeping them from you. Someone doesn't want the truth to come out. But I must try. I left because I was afraid. Afraid for your life and mine. You were too young to remember the night in the barn. Maybe that's a mercy. Harold, your father, was not the man you believed him to be. There were things he did, things he was part of, and I tried to stop it. But in the end, I had to run. I couldn't take you with me. It would have been too dangerous. I prayed that someday you would understand. If you ever do read this, please know, I never stopped loving you. My breath caught in my throat. I looked down at the rows of letters, unanswered cries in the dark. My mother had never spoken of these. Had she never received them? Or had she chosen not to read them? I read another, and another. Each one revealed more of the same story. A growing fear, a creeping darkness surrounding my grandfather. Mentions of a group he was part of, strange rituals, whispered oaths. It sounded like madness. But Margaret's words were lucid, detailed, and desperate. She described the barn fire. A man had died that night. His name was Peter Langston, a neighbor, a friend. Margaret claimed he discovered something terrible, and he was silenced. She wrote of arguments with Harold, threats, and the night she knew she had to disappear. There are things buried in that house, Eleanor. I never wanted Helen to bear the weight of this. But maybe one day her daughter will come. Maybe she'll be strong enough to find the truth. If so, go to the cellar. I looked up from the letter, heart pounding. The cellar. I had forgotten it even existed. A trapdoor beneath the pantry, sealed for as long as I could remember. As a child, I thought it led to monsters. Maybe I wasn't far off. I spent the next few hours reading. There were moments where I had to stop, when the weight of it became too much. Margaret's voice grew more desperate as the years passed, her handwriting more shaky. But her message never changed. She loved her daughter. She feared her husband. She wanted someone, anyone, to find the truth. By the time I stood and closed the trunk, the attic light had grown dim. Dusk was settling across the house, casting long shadows that curled along the walls like smoke. I felt the pull of the cellar like a thread tugging at my spine. But I wasn't ready yet. That night, I stayed in my grandmother's room. The bed creaked beneath me, and I lay awake for hours, the letters replaying in my mind. I thought of my mother, quiet, guarded, full of sadness she never explained. What had she known? What had she buried with her silence? Around midnight I heard it, a soft creak downstairs. Then another. I froze, listening. Was it the house settling? Or something else? I tiptoed to the landing and looked down the staircase. Nothing but darkness. But in the distance, I saw something faint. A light. flickering, near the pantry door. When I reached it, the light was gone. Only the trapdoor remained, dusty, unopened, but somehow waiting. Part 3, The Cellar. Morning came gray and sluggish, with fog hanging low over the hills outside. I hadn't slept. Every creak of the old house fed my growing unease. But more than fear, I felt a need, a pull I couldn't ignore. The cellar. I stood in the pantry, staring down at the old trapdoor, its hinges rusted and bolted shut with 2 heavy iron latches. Dust had gathered thick around the edges, untouched for decades. Took me an hour to open it. The first latch came free with enough force. The second resisted. I dug through the garage and found an old crowbar. When it finally gave way, it cracked open like a coffin. The air that rushed out was cold, ancient. With a flashlight in hand, I descended into the dark. The cellar steps were wooden and steep, the kind that moaned with each step. The space below was larger than I remembered. Not just a storage room, this was something else. The walls were stone, damp. Mold crept across them like veins. But what struck me most wasn't the cold or the silence. It was the careful arrangement of items, objects set with purpose. On a long table, there were rows of old mason jars filled with what looked like herbs, powders, strange seeds. Books were stacked in piles, some handwritten, others leather-bound with broken spines. Candle stubs littered the floor. The smell of wax and earth was strong. And in the corner, wrapped in a rotting cloth tarp, sat a wooden crate. I pulled back the tarp. Inside was a journal. Its cover was cracked and weathered, but the name was still legible. Harold Whitmore, my grandfather. I opened it with trembling hands. The entries inside began benignly enough: weather notes, mentions of planting seasons, references to the community garden. But quickly, the tone shifted. Margaret suspects. She sees the meetings, the whispers, but she doesn't understand. She never understood. Blood is legacy. Blood is purity. She defies the order. Peter Langston has become a threat. He asks questions, pokes his nose into old histories. He'll force my hand. Margaret will not stop. She speaks of betrayal and justice. But she forgets. This house remembers who it belongs to. Each page grew darker. Mentions of rituals. A circle of preservation. Sacrifices not always literal but still chilling. The group Harold belonged to wasn't just some backwoods superstition. They believed they were guarding the town's spiritual balance, purging impurity, maintaining order through silence and blood. Helen must be kept clean of this. Margaret doesn't see, doesn't understand what must be protected. The child must never know. She will grow up good, normal. I flipped to the back of the book, heart pounding. There were drawings, symbols, altars, even what looked like blueprints of the cellar. Hidden compartments, storage spaces. One of them was marked behind the wall. I turned and ran my hands along the stone until I found it. A seam in the wall that echoed hollow when tapped. I pried at the edges with the crowbar until it cracked open. Behind it, a bundle of blackened cloth. Inside, bones. Small. Human. My legs gave out. I sat in the dirt and stared at the remains, trying to breathe, trying not to scream. I didn't know who the bones belonged to. I didn't want to know. But I understood now why Margaret had run. This wasn't just about betrayal or abuse. It was about murder. Covered up. Forgotten. Protected. I climbed out of the cellar hours later, numb. The journal clutched in my hand, the air heavier than ever. I placed it on the kitchen table and stared at it under the light of a single bulb. How much had my mother known? Did she remember Peter Langston? Did she suspect anything about her father? Or had she buried it, like the letters in the attic? I couldn't ask her now. But I could do what Margaret never could. I could speak. That night, I took the journal and the letters and began scanning them into my laptop. I created a folder, labeled it "For Truth," and saved everything. I didn't know what I was going to do with it yet. The police? The local paper? Podcast? But the silence had lived too long. As I typed, I thought I heard footsteps upstairs. I paused, listened. Nothing. Then again. A slow, dragging creak. I rose and climbed the stairs, flashlight in hand. The hallway was empty, but the attic door was open, and on the floor just beneath it, one of Margaret's letters. Open. But I hadn't opened it. I bent down to read. Eleanor, if you've made it this far, you now know what I couldn't prove. What they denied. The house remembers. It holds what was done. And it will not let go until someone tells the story. Be careful. They still watch. Even now. Part 4. The letter I wrote. I didn't sleep that night. The attic stayed open above me, like an open mouth waiting to whisper. Every sound the house made, the tick of the radiator, the groan of old wood, felt like breath on the back of my neck. I stayed at the kitchen table, staring at the journal, the stack of Margaret's letters beside it. My coffee went cold, untouched. My laptop screen dimmed and died. And still I sat thinking. What did it mean? They still watch. Was Margaret being metaphorical? Or had the group Harold was part of whatever this order was, somehow survived? I didn't want to believe it. But if they were capable of covering up murder in the past, what else were they capable of? At dawn, I walked outside for the first time in 2 days. The fog was thick, pressing against the trees like wet wool. Birds called from somewhere out of sight, but the hill felt still, unnaturally so. I wandered through the garden out back, now overgrown. Weeds choked the flower beds. The orchard was bare. Then I saw it. The barn. It stood at the edge of the field, mostly collapsed now, the wood eaten away by time. But I remembered it well. Margaret's letters had mentioned it again and again. The night in the barn, the fire, Peter Langston. I stepped inside. The air smelled like damp ash. Charred beams littered the floor. A circle of black still stained the earth at the center, like the wound had never healed. I found more remnants. Scraps of fabric, rusted tools, an old lantern, and something else. A shallow depression in the far corner, covered with boards. When I pried them loose, I found bones. Not just one set, several. Stacked, hidden, buried beneath 30 years of dust. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. My legs carried me out of the barn and into the cold light of morning before I collapsed in the grass, gasping. Peter Langston hadn't been the only one. I drove to town that afternoon. I needed air. And answers. The town hadn't changed much. Same faded storefronts, same coffee shop, same gas station on the corner. I parked near the library and walked inside. The librarian was older, with a warm smile and a name tag that read June. She looked up from her desk. "You're a Whitmore, aren't you?" she asked softly. I nodded, surprised. "Eleanor. Margaret was my grandmother." June's smile faded just a little. "She was a good woman," she said after a pause. "A loud one, but good. Do you remember what happened to her?" June hesitated, then gestured for me to follow. She led me to a back room filled with old newspaper archives. "I wasn't here back then, but I've heard the stories. And I've seen a few things." She pulled out a yellowed folder. Inside, clippings, photos, notes. All connected to a night in 1992. The fire. Peter Langston's death. The sudden disappearance of Margaret Whitmore. There were inconsistencies in the official report. No witnesses, no investigation beyond a week. Harold's name appeared once, then vanished, as though scrubbed. "That file's been borrowed and returned more than anything else in here," June said. "Usually by older men. Same ones who run the town council now." My stomach turned. "Do you know anything about a group?" I asked. "Something called the Circle of Preservation." June froze, then nodded once. "It was a society, founded decades ago, long before you were born. Mostly men, wealthy, old names. They claimed to protect the town's traditions." She made air quotes. "But they were more like a secret court. They dealt in rumors, punishments, quiet threats. People who crossed them tended to leave town or vanish." June gave me a long, sad look. "I think your grandmother tried to expose them, and I think she paid the price." I drove back to Sycamore Hill with wind roaring through the open window and tears drying on my cheeks. The road twisted like the knot in my chest. Margaret had tried. She'd seen what Harold and his group had done. She'd tried to tell the truth. She had tried to protect my mother. And no one had listened. But I would. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. I wrote a letter. To my mother. Dear Mom, I don't know if you ever saw her letters. If you ever suspected what your father did. Maybe you did and you buried it like everything else. But I've seen it now. I know what happened in the barn. I know who Peter Langston was. And I know what Margaret tried to protect you from. I wish you were here so I could ask you. I wish I could hand you her letters. But all I can do is finish what she started. I'm going to tell the world. I'll tell them what happened on Sycamore Hill. I placed the letter in an envelope and walked it to the attic. I placed it in the cedar trunk, alongside all the others. Margaret's story would not be lost. Not this time. Part 5 echoes. 2 days after returning from town, I began compiling everything. The journal, the letters, photographs of the bones, scans of old newspapers, even an audio file I recorded of June telling me what she knew. I didn't know exactly what I was creating. An archive? A confession? A warning? But I called the folder on my desktop Whitmore Truth. The file grew quickly. I stayed in the house, sleeping little, eating less, obsessed with piecing together the truth. Not just for Margaret, not just for my mother, but for me. For the silence I had carried my whole life without understanding why. For the nights I'd heard my mother crying behind closed doors. For the long stares she'd give the ceiling when she thought I wasn't watching. She had been haunted, and now I was too. On the third night I had a dream. I was a child again, walking the hallways of the house, barefoot. The wallpaper was darker. The light bulbs flickered. Every door I passed whispered my name. Eleanor, Eleanor. I opened the attic door. Margaret stood at the trunk, one hand resting on the lid. She turned to me slowly, eyes sunken, skin pale as paper. But she didn't speak. She only looked at me with sorrow and pride. I woke up crying, and in my lap, somehow, was one of her letters. I hadn't brought it to bed. I wasn't alone in that house anymore. Maybe I never had been. That morning, I received an email from an address I didn't recognize. Subject: You don't know what you're doing. The message was short. Leave it buried. You're not the first to try. You won't be the last to regret it. I stared at the screen. Then another message arrived. This time a photo. It was me, taken from behind the trees outside the house. I was walking into the barn. My blood turned to ice. Someone was watching. Now that I packed everything, the letters, the journal, the photos, and drove straight to the police station. The officer at the front desk gave me a skeptical look until I showed him the bones in the barn, the photo, and the journal. He read the first page, then called his supervisor. Within an hour, I was in a conference room with 2 detectives, going through the entire story. They didn't roll their eyes. They listened. They promised to investigate. Promised to send a forensics team to Sycamore Hill. Promised to reach out to other families, descendants of names mentioned in the journal. I left the station shaken but lighter. I'd done it. I'd broken the silence. The next day, the news broke. Remains found on Whitmore property. Investigation underway into historic town group allegations. Photos of the barn. A blurry image of Margaret. My name was not mentioned. I'd asked for anonymity for now. But the truth was out. It spread quickly. Some townsfolk were outraged. Others, silent. Some reached out to me through private messages. People who had also lost family members who had suspected things but never had proof. The whispers Margaret had tried to shout had become a voice. And that voice was finally being heard. That night, I returned to Sycamore Hill one last time. The house felt different. The air was lighter, the shadows less cruel. I walked through each room in silence, saying goodbye. In the attic, I sat beside the cedar trunk and opened my laptop. I wrote one last entry. To the next person who finds this house, this place holds pain but also truth. You are not crazy. You are not imagining things. Margaret tried to protect her daughter. I tried to protect the story. Now it's your turn. Keep the truth alive. Eleanor Whitmore. I closed the laptop, sealed it in a plastic case, and placed it beneath the floorboard under the trunk, just in case. Then I walked down the stairs, out the front door, and left Sycamore Hill behind. For good. Or so I thought. Part 6. The Hill Remains. I moved back to the city. My old apartment felt foreign now, too clean, too quiet. But life slowly returned, piece by piece. I returned to work. I started therapy. I walked the same streets I'd always walked, but something fundamental had changed inside me. When you drag the truth out of darkness, you don't walk away untouched. The police investigation unfolded slowly, as they always do. The remains found in the barn were confirmed to be human. 3 different individuals. One of them was tentatively identified as Peter Langston. DNA confirmed a match with a distant nephew. Articles flooded the internet. True crime bloggers and amateur sleuths picked it up. A local podcast ran a 5-part series titled The Circle Beneath the Hill. I was invited to speak, but I declined. I said enough. The town held a memorial service for the unidentified victims. I went. It was quiet, respectful. A few dozen people stood with candles as names were read. Not all names were known, but that wasn't the point. It was about giving them something they had been denied for too long. A voice. A month passed. Then another. I kept thinking about Margaret, wondering if, wherever she was, she knew what I had done, if she felt peace, if she still lingered in the creaking floorboards and drifting scent of lavender. Then, one evening, I got a letter in the mail. Real postage. No handwriting I recognized. Inside was a short note. I knew Margaret. I was in the group. Not all of us agreed. Some of us were afraid. Thank you for finishing what she started. D. No return address. No signature beyond the initial. But it chilled me to the bone. Someone was still alive. Watching. Regretful. Possibly protecting me? I burned the letter. I didn't want more whispers. I'd had enough. Weeks later, I returned to Sycamore Hill for the last time. The house had been locked up by the authorities. A thin yellow ribbon crossed the front porch. The investigation was still technically active, but I had special permission to walk the grounds. It was spring now. The orchard had bloomed. For the first time in years, maybe decades, the lavender bushes lining the porch had flowered. Bright, violet, and alive. Their scent drifted softly on the breeze, just like in my childhood. I sat on the porch steps and stared at the hills, the fields, the house that had shaped 3 generations of women. Margaret had been silenced. My mother had lived in the shadow of that silence. And I had chosen to speak. Not because I was brave, but because I couldn't bear to carry it any longer. Before I left, I placed one final letter in the mailbox at the foot of the drive. It wasn't addressed to anyone in particular, just written for the world to find. To whoever comes next, this place remembers. It remembers pain, yes, but also love. It remembers the ones who tried to speak, and the ones who finally did. If you hear whispers, don't be afraid. They're not ghosts. They're just stories, waiting to be heard. E.W. As I walked away, the wind picked up. The porch creaked. The lavender swayed. And for just a moment, only a moment, I thought I heard her laugh. Deep, thunderous, just like rain.